Welcome back to Beyond Sunday School. Glad to have you with us this week. We are continuing in our series on putting Jesus in his place. And so right now we are in the midst of a discussion on, who did Jesus think he was? So a couple of tongue-in-cheek kind of titles here, hopefully to be a bit intriguing and get us talking about some things. But we're looking at the person and work of Jesus primarily through the lens of history, with some theology and also with some literature. If you want to look at why we are kind of approaching things from that direction, you can look at our previous season, putting the New Testament in its place. You can also go back further and check out New Testament background and kind of learning a little bit more about the history of the time of the New Testament. And then before that, we spent a season looking at Israel's monarchy. So there's plenty of information, plenty of things that you can go back and check out to help you continue in your pursuit of knowledge and understanding of the biblical text. And so as we dive in here, we are jumping off of a New Testament survey called The New Testament in Its World by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird. It is, in my opinion, one of the best New Testament surveys out right now, because it's partially because it's new and is asking some contemporary questions, and it's picking up on some of the more recent discussions about issues in the New Testament. And so we're jumping off that text. If you would want to grab it, you are welcome to. This week, we are specifically looking at this question of whether or not Jesus thought of himself as Messiah. And so as we wrestle through this, this week is going to be pretty scripture heavy. We're gonna look at the scriptures quite a bit. There's a lot of references to the Bible this week, and so really this week, maybe more than some of the other ones, you're going to get a very clear sense of how this issue of history and theology come together in the text of the Bible. And so hopefully that will be interesting to you. If not, I don't know what to tell you. But we record this every Wednesday night at 7:00, and we would love to have you in the Zoom room with us. Because if you're here in the Zoom room, you can ask questions as we go throughout the evening. And so you will hear some voices potentially on the recording. If you're listening to this later, if you're watching this on YouTube, these are the folks that are here in the Zoom room with me. So I've got a few friends hanging out tonight, and they will interrupt and ask questions as they come to their minds. And so, boy, would love to have you in here as well, because as you're listening to this, you may have questions, and if you are in the room with us, you could ask those questions live. So join us sometime. Just reach out to me on any of the social networks. You can find me by my kind of consistent username across all those networks, at Daniel M. Rose. And we'd love to have you join us in the Zoom room. So without further ado, let's get talking here. Let's look at some of this stuff, and we will roll. So, who does Jesus think he is? Right? This guy is maybe the most influential figure in the history of mankind. He's right. There's kind of Jesus and Muhammad are really kind of the two big ones, if you really think about it, as far as just kind of level of influence. And so trying to figure out who did Jesus think he was, right? Who did he understand himself to be? Because as we read through the New Testament, as we read through the scriptures, we can so often read back into things. And so using history, using theology, using the literature of the New Testament, we are trying to get down to it. Who did Jesus think he was? So this week we're talking about the Messiah, and did he think of himself as the Messiah? Now, as we do, we need to recognize the fact that there were no uniform set of expectations for the Messiah in the first century. There just weren't. Like, it's not like people were walking around with some sort of a handbook that said, okay, this is a Messianic thing. Check, check, check. Like, they didn't have that. There were a lot of different ideas floating around. There was this huge spectrum of thoughts and expectations. And so there were four, we call them threads, four main threads of Messianic expectation. And these are kind of big picture ideas, right? And so the first thread was that the Messiah would be a military leader who would expel the sinners and Gentiles. I mean, this was kind of one of the big ideas, is that the Messiah would come in and would kick out all the sinners, would kick out the Gentiles, and they would get back to kind of a pure Jewish country. Another big thread that was kind of floating around out there is that the Messiah would be someone with supernatural powers, right? A guy who was going to, do all these miraculous things and was transcendent. And, I don't know if like he had a glow about him or what, but there was just this sense that that the Messiah would be supernatural in power. The Qumran community, they expected two Messiahs. They expected the Messiah of Aaron and the Messiah of Israel. I didn't do a deep dive into what that meant, but suffice it to say that was part of their communal expectation, and maybe this is where we get some of the two witnesses ideas from John in the book of Revelation, right? He may have been tapping into this same kind of idea. But then the fourth big thread that was floating around out there was from a guy named Philo, and he expected a Messiah that would establish a Jewish empire. His expectation was that the Messiah would come back, he would reign as king, and not only would he return back to, return the kingdom of Israel back to a pure kind of real independent kingdom, but that they would also then go and conquer the surrounding nations and really rebuild the Jewish empire, similar to maybe thinking about what it was like under the king, under King Solomon. And you can learn more about that in our first season, looking at the history of Israel's monarchy. So there's a pitch to go back. So these are kind of the threads, right? And these threads became a tapestry. It might be another way to think about this. And so Wright and Bird say it this way. They say the shared thread of Jewish messianism or messianism in the various tapestries that hung around from time to time was a future hope for a royal and eschatological deliverer to liberate Israel, cleanse or rebuild the temple so that Israel's God would at least return in glory, and establish a renewed Jewish kingdom, perhaps thereby bringing justice to the world. In the end, we might define the Messiah as an agent of God in the end time who is said to be somewhere in the literature to be anointed, but who is not necessarily called Messiah in every passage. And so a couple of things to note as we think about this whole issue about the Messiah, and that is that this is very much a royal connotation, right? Like some of you may have heard about Jesus, the idea of Jesus holding three offices: prophet, priest, and king. And so this office of Messiah, or this title of Messiah, is on that royal end of things. This is the king, kind of the king aspect, but it's not just the king. It's the king as priest. It's the king as prophet. It is a royal prophet and priest. And so this really goes back to kind of the idea of what we saw in David, what we saw in Solomon, these men, these kings that were truly anointed by God, and had kind of this. They weren't just people who were. They weren't just leaders in the governmental sense, but they also had an important influence and impact religiously. And so when we think about Messiah, this is what we're talking about. And one of the important things here in this Wright and Bird bring out is the idea that that this agent of God in the end time, who is talked about in the literature being the Bible, but who is not necessarily called Messiah in every passage. That's an important thing, because sometimes the way somebody acts is more important than some title that they put on themselves. And I think that's what we might, I think that's what we're going to see as we walk through who Jesus was, as he tried to embody this idea of Messiah. Now, the question is, did Jesus claim to be the Messiah? Well, we've got some problems here. And if we're going to be honest to the text, if we're going to hold the Bible in high esteem, then we have to look at the problems. Problem number one: Jesus never self-applies the title in the Gospels. Jesus never refers to himself as the Messiah. Not once. He is called it by others, right? I mean, the demons say things like, "You're the Messiah, the Son of God," that kind of thing. But Jesus never says, "I am the Messiah." It's just not a title that he has. So what does this mean? Well, it could mean that Jesus inspired these hopes, but never embraced the title. That's one possibility. But the reality is that Jesus doesn't use it. Now, where Jesus seems to accept the title resembles early Christian confessions. So, for instance, Mark 8:29, and so when we say that this resembles early Christian confessions, what we mean by that is if you go and you start looking through some of the later writings, post New Testament, and you look at some of the writings in the early church, and you see their confessions that they wrote about, they hit very similarly to what we read in these passages in the Gospels. And so what a lot of people think may have happened is that as Mark, as Matthew, as Luke, as John were writing the Gospels, they brought that language to the text, which is, it doesn't make the text bad. It doesn't make it, a problem or anything like that. It just means that they were people who are writing in a context at a specific place and time, and they were bringing the language that they had about Jesus to the text, which is what we would expect if people wrote down the Bible. And so if you look at like Mark 8:29, this is where where Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah, right? Jesus says, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. So there's this sense here that Jesus, he doesn't say you're wrong, right? So he is accepting it. He's accepting that designation, but this idea of who do you say that I am? You're the Messiah fits an early Christian confession. Now, did the confession come from this interaction between Peter and Jesus? Did Mark write this confession into the text? We don't really know, right? Now, in Mark chapter 14, 61 and 62, we have something similar. This is where Jesus is standing before the Sanhedrin. And so in verse 60, we'll start in verse 60. He said, "Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?' But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?' Jesus," and then verse 62, "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds in heaven." So again, Jesus says, "I am." Like, he responds affirmatively, but but again, it is the chief priest who is putting that title on to him. And we see similar things again in John chapter 4, John chapter 18. And so all this is doing is it just raises the question. It raises a question of, is it possible that the gospel writers wrote their own beliefs back into the story? Is that a possibility? And so when it comes to this issue of, did Jesus claim to be the Messiah, these are kind of the problems that we have to wrestle through. So what does that lead us to? Well, we have problems from the problems. So what do we mean by that? Well, a denial that Jesus didn't think of himself as Messiah simply creates more problems, right? And so what are the problems that come from the problems? Well, we have to ask the question, why was Jesus crucified as a messianic pretender? If Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah, then why was he crucified as one claiming to be the Messiah? What's happening there? How did the messianic faith in the early church begin? If Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah, how did this concept come to be applied to him by the early church? Why would they have fabricated that out of thin air? That's a tough one. And then, where did the early evangelists get the idea to cast Jesus as a Messiah? Again, if he never claimed it, then if he never claimed that title for himself, then why did they, as the early evangelists were telling the story of Christ, why did they cast him in that role? Why did they place him in that role? Where did that come from? So one suggested answer is the resurrection. And so the idea here is that because Jesus rose from the dead, this is what made the whole early church go, "Oh, we see he's the Messiah because he rose from the dead. Oh, we get it now." Well, the problem is the resurrection prior to this time, a resurrection was never tied to messiahship before. If it was, excuse me, if it was, you would think that Lazarus would have been considered to be a Messiah, right? Because he was dead. He was dead long enough for people to be worried that his body was stinking. But Jesus went in there and rose him, and he rose from the dead. So, you have these, dry spot. So you have, so because in the Jewish writings, in the Jewish culture, this idea of resurrection just simply wasn't tied to the messianic concepts at the time. So it doesn't make sense that the resurrection itself was the thing that tipped them all off to it. Now, another suggested answer was put forth by a guy named William Reed. He's a theologian from back in the day, and his argument is that it was the Messianic Secret. And we saw that in that verse from Mark that we read just a minute ago. Now, the Messianic Secret is that it's that point where, as Jesus is interacting with people, he says, okay, don't tell anyone, right? He would heal somebody, or don't tell anyone, or like when Peter made his statement, he says, okay, don't tell anyone. So Reed is saying, listen, the secret was kept, and because the secret was kept, the early church didn't know about it until after Jesus's resurrection and ascension. And then everybody said, hey, by the way, we said these things and he told us not to tell anybody, so now we all know. And it just doesn't seem credible. It doesn't seem credible from the sense of even reading through the Gospels, where the people most often that Jesus told not to tell didn't listen to him. They all went and told, which is why the crowds kept growing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And Jesus had to consistently withdraw from the urban areas and go out into the wilderness, because people weren't hiding it, because people weren't keeping the secret. So, but then you also have the other question of, okay, then why did the Romans, when they nailed him to the cross, say, hey, he's the king of the Jews, he's their Messiah? Why did they put that there? If the secret was kept, did it make any sense then for the early church to write this back in if it wasn't really the thing? There's so many problems with Reed's answer to this problem that it just doesn't seem to make sense. So where do we go from here? How do we move forward? Well, it turns out that there were some good reasons that Jesus did claim to be the Messiah. The first one is from Isaiah 61. This is one of the most influential, important passages when it comes to the idea of the Messiah and messianic expectations in the first century. This is Isaiah's proclamation of the Lord's favor. This is just one of those beautiful passages, right? And Isaiah 61 starts this way: the Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of the splendor. And it just goes on. And so this passage, Isaiah 61, really seems to be a significant scripture that shapes Jesus's self-understanding. So let's take a quick look at how we get to that point. Well, in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 through 21, this is Jesus's Nazareth moment, right? And so he's just come out of the wilderness. He's just been tested, and so he goes to Galilee, goes to Nazareth, and he goes in to the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." That's Isaiah 61, right? He is quoting Isaiah 61 and 2. That's what he's reading from. And he says, they rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Right? So he understood himself to be the fulfillment of Isaiah 61. So while Jesus doesn't say, "Hey, I'm the Messiah," by taking Isaiah 61 and applying it to himself, he is in a sense saying, hey, I'm the Messiah. He's just not using that word, right? And then you get into Luke chapter 7, verses 18 through 23. John's disciples told him about all these things, calling two of them. He sent them to the Lord to ask, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? When the men came to Jesus, they said, John the Baptist sent us to ask you, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? At that very time, Jesus cured many who had diseases, sicknesses, and evil spirits, and gave sight to many who were blind. So he replied to the messengers, go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. What does that sound like? That sounds like Isaiah 61. He is again taking Isaiah 61 and is referencing it back to himself. And so not just in words like he did back in Luke chapter 4, but also now in deed. He's demonstrating this before them, saying, I am the one, I am the anointed one of Isaiah 61. I am embodying this reality. Now, along with this, we have, there's a text in the Dead Sea Scrolls that they've found that had a list of messianic deeds, and it ties right into Isaiah 61. So there was one of those threads, right? Remember, we talked about threads of ideas here at the very opening. Well, this list of messianic deeds in that Dead Sea community, they pulled right from Isaiah 61. So while Jesus may not have ever said, hey, I'm the Messiah, he took Isaiah 61 and said, this is me. I am fulfilling this, which would have then translated to, hey, look at me. I'm the Messiah. Now, that's number one. That's first good reason. Second good reason we have that Jesus claimed to be Messiah is that Jesus had a self-understanding of having a special role in the kingdom of God, right? So what does he do here? Well, how do we see that play out? Well, he calls his 12 disciples, his 12 apostles, right? And so we know that the 12 apostles directly relate back to the 12 tribes of Israel. This is the reconstitution of Israel, right? This is Jesus by calling these 12 apostles saying, hey, I am reconstituting the people of Israel. This is where we're heading. But notice, and this is one of those things where when you see it the first time, you go, oh my gosh, how have I never noticed this before? Jesus was not one of the 12. Jesus was outside of the 12. Jesus was their leader. He was one in authority over them. In Matthew 19 and in Luke 22, Jesus tells the 12, you're going to judge Israel and you will receive power from the Father, just like he has given it to me, is basically the summary of those passages. Right. And so he is understanding himself as the one who is above the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel, which would then put him in that royal position. He sees himself as being the royal leader of the new Israel, of the now redeemed Israel, the Israel that is now coming out of exile finally and perfectly through this work, right? In the eschatology, in the eschaton, the culmination of the history of Israel. This is who Jesus understood himself to be, which puts him firmly in that place of Messiah. So again, he doesn't say, hey, look at me, I'm the Messiah. But the things that he starts doing are communicating to those that are watching. He thinks he's the Messiah. He sees himself and understands himself as Messiah. Now, that's reason number two. Reason number three, Jesus saw himself in a lineage associated with the great royal figures from Israel's history, which was an interesting thing for me to think through, because I had never really made those kinds of connections before. But in Matthew 12, 42, he's talking, he's talking about the sign of Jonah in Matthew 12, starting in verse 38. He says, then some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to him, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." He answered, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And now something greater than Jonah is here." Verse 42, "The queen of the south will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and now something greater than Solomon is here." He is putting himself firmly in that lineage, saying, not only am I in the line of Solomon, I am greater than Solomon. Like this was a big statement for him to make. In Mark chapter 2, verse 23, it's the story of, this is the story where Jesus and the guys are walking through the field on the Sabbath, and they're hungry. And the Pharisees, and they start plucking the heads of grain, and the Pharisees are like, "Yo, what's going on here?" And Jesus answers, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So he's saying, listen, I'm doing nothing that, David didn't do. And not only that, but I have control over the Sabbath. I mean, he's making these statements, and he's acting these things out, and he's living out this royal power. And he's saying, by the way that he is living and acting, he is saying, I am the king who is to come. I am the Messiah. So even though he doesn't take the title, self-apply the title, he is embodying it. Our fourth thing is Jesus's final week. I mean, the Passion was Messiah in action. It is a lived out parable of what the Messiah was supposed to do, right? So he acts out Zechariah chapter 9 when he enters the city, right? When he enters into Jerusalem. Zechariah chapter 9, starting in verse 9, says, "Rejoice. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly, and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And so he is living this out. He is acting out this triumphal entry from Zechariah 9. You can read about it in Mark 11, 1 through 10. And not only that, as he enters into the city, not only is he living out Zechariah 9 and embodying it, it also mirrors what Judas Maccabeus had done 100 years before, which made an effective claim to royalty. And Judas Maccabeus brought in this new kind of reign as a king for a period of time in Jerusalem. And so Jesus is really pressing into this royal these royal illusions and illustrations as the Passion Week begins. Now, we also see him claiming royal authority over the temple by warning of its imminent destruction. Read that in Mark chapter 11. his prediction of rebuilding the temple, and his prediction of rebuilding the temple, which is messianic in nature, right? So who built the temple? Well, you had David, who had the idea of building the temple. He wanted to build the temple. God said, no, you've got too much blood on your hands. So then Solomon actually does build the temple. You see, this was done by the king. The priests didn't build the temple, right? The king built the temple. So for him to say, I can judge the temple, or I can judge, I have authority over the temple and I can judge it. It's going to be destroyed, but I can also rebuild it. You see, these are things that tie him right into this messianic and royal tradition. In Mark chapter 12, he engages the scribes on messianic identity, right? This is one of those fun little interactions that Jesus has with the scribes in verses 35 and 37. It says, while Jesus was teaching in the temple courts, he asked, why do the teachers of the law say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, speaking by the Holy Spirit, declared, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. David himself calls him Lord. How then can he be his son? The large crowd listened to him with delight. In other words, he's saying there's something going on with the Messiah that David understood. His Lord, this whole thing of the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. Like, this is, how can he be his son? Right. And what is going on here? So there, Jesus is, we'll touch on that in a couple of weeks too, when we look at Jesus as God. But this idea of the Messiah and his identity being one in the lineage of David. Jesus understands himself to be the smitten shepherd who saves his people, based out of Zechariah 13, verse 7. So he gets into this in Mark 14, 27. We're here kind of in the Last Supper. Jesus is predicting Peter's denial. He says, you will all fall away, Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. So he's identifying himself as the shepherd who saves his people. And so again, he's not taking the title and applying it to himself. He's just living the title out. And then as he's dealing with Caiaphas in his interaction, right? In verse 62, he says, we already read this, but in verse 62, I am in the question of, are you the Messiah? And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. What he's doing here is he's conflating Psalm 110 and Daniel 7:13. So Daniel 7:13 says this. He says, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. And then Psalm 110 says this. It says, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So you see how he's bringing the two of those ideas together as he affirms in a response to Caiaphas. Now, he's kind of oblique with it, right? Like he doesn't like totally fully say, man, finally somebody gets it. He just says, I am. And then this, and he takes these two ideas, these two verses, and brings them together. So this whole final week of Jesus's life was all wrapped up in messianic action. And so he's living it out. He's bringing all these threads and ideas and concepts together from the Old Testament into this present moment. And then finally, the fifth thing, Jesus was crucified for being a messianic pretender. In other words, he was crucified for showing the world that he is the King of the Jews. The Roman statement of crime nailed over his head, which is known as a titular, was called, so it was listed as the King of the Jews. Like this is who he was. This is why he was being crucified for. This was also highlighted in all four Gospels, right? This statement that the Romans nailed that crime, the statement of crime over his head on the cross, the King of the Jews, is stated in all four Gospels. It was that important. It is that important. And Wright and Bird say that, make this point. They say it is impossible to explain why this would have been the charge if Jesus had never given any indication of royal inclinations. There's no way to explain that. That had to come from somewhere. And I think just by taking that deeper look into the last week of Jesus's life, if that was his last week, and then you expand that out over 3 years of his public active ministry, you can see why people saw and understood his actions to have been tied to royal inclinations. The idea of him being the Messiah, the King of the Jews, the one who would bring them out of exile. And so this was a tough deal for the Romans to wrap their minds around. And so while there are problems, and while there are problems from the problems, the reality is there are very good reasons that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Now, from there, from these good reasons that we see in Jesus, the good reasons that we laid out here, lead us to another question that we have to wrestle through, and it is, how did Jesus's understanding of himself as Israel's Messiah fit with his understanding of Israel's one God? How did those two ideas come together? And we will go there next week. But I want to wrap this up by reading this quote from Wright and Bird, which really kind of brings this thing to the landing place. They say, Jesus deliberately acted out a messianic role. This is on page 230 of their New Testament survey. This was why the early church began as a kingdom movement, venerating him as its messianic leader. Of course, none of this would have been taken further had Jesus's first followers not been convinced that he had been raised from the dead. Everybody knew that a crucified Messiah was a failed Messiah. Equally, to repeat what was said above, the resurrection would not have created these stories with their messianic overtones out of thin air. The meaning given to the resurrection is only comprehensible historically on the basis of what was known about Jesus prior to his death. You see, we can't work our way backwards from the resurrection to make the Messiah thing make sense. We have to start with looking at the proof of the Messiah thing for us to have the resurrection mean what it ultimately comes to mean. So, because in that idea of a dead Messiah as a failed Messiah, is because, remember, this idea of Messiah is one of royal power, royal authority, bringing Israel to its eschaton, bringing it to its historical climax. And so if this messianic, if this person who is claiming to be the Messiah doesn't rise from the dead, if they just die, then they really are not. They're really not this long-awaited for Messiah, and so this is what ultimately gives the resurrection its power. It's the fact that Jesus acted out, lived as the Messiah. So that was, again, a ton of information, huge information dump. And so for those of you that are listening on the podcast, this is uploaded on my YouTube page where there are slides each week with an outline, and you can catch all of those scripture references and things in the slides. And if anybody wants those emailed to them, just let me know, and I can send those over. But ladies, as you guys have been listening now for a good close to an hour, all the information, what's bouncing through your heads? Do you have questions or thoughts floating around here from all of this stuff?
My head is exploding.
Right? Oh,
I'm looking way back to when you first started.
mm-hmm.
This is that simple mind kicking in again. In the one verse in Mark 14, when Jesus answers, "I am."
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, that seems so simple. Right there, Jesus was saying, "I am the Messiah."
Yeah.
But I forgot how you explained it. You said something about the person who was the writer of the gospel was putting his own thoughts and own beliefs as he was writing.
He could be, right? Like this is the thing. Do we know for sure that Mark was? We don't know for sure. Could he be writing back into his history a confession that the early church, that the church that he was a part of was using? It's a possibility, right? Because this idea of, who do you say Jesus is? Is Jesus the Messiah? He is. Like these confessions that were being used in the first century church, were they were probably, the confessions themselves were probably earlier than the written gospel. So what came first? This, was this the exact conversation that took place between Caiaphas and Jesus? They didn't have recorders. They didn't have somebody standing there writing all this down. Do we know with 100% certainty this was the exact conversation? We don't. And so what was, so where did that kind of concept of the conversation come from? Now, from reliable witnesses, yeah, I think we can believe that there are reliable witnesses who confirmed that, right? It didn't come out of thin air. It's not that Mark was sitting there going, okay, I bet Caiaphas might have said something like this and then wrote it down. He did his research, he engaged, he talked to people who he needed to talk to. But at the same time, is it the exact phrasing, the exact way that conversation went? Maybe. But there's also a possibility that the way he worded that interaction came from those church confessions that were taking place in his worshiping environment, right? Because the church was living and acting and being the church before the Gospels got written. It's not like the Gospels got written and then all of a sudden the church happened. The church happened, and then they said, "Boy, we need some written down. We need the story. We need this written down. We need these Gospels written down." And so they wrote them down. They went from that oral tradition to that written tradition. So there's just a possibility, because that's how we all write. That's how we all do things, right? The way we phrase things come from how we live and the things that we've read and the things that have influenced us. So does that make sense?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Sort of. Yeah.
So basically what you're saying is the way that conversation was written down, perhaps Jesus didn't actually say, "I am the Messiah."
Right. Or yeah, I mean, perhaps that exact question wasn't put to him.
Okay.
Right. Like, because what scholars have found in some of these early confessions, those early confessions line up so well with these kind of interactions it's a chicken or the egg thing. Which came first, the confession or the text, right? Which came first, the confession or the gospel? Obviously, Jesus' interaction with Caiaphas came first, but they didn't have video cameras. How close were the disciples who were hearing this? How close were they to the interaction between Jesus and Caiaphas? Nicodemus probably was in there, in the Sanhedrin, because he was a member of the Sanhedrin. So maybe they got that info from Nicodemus, like that, because Mark wasn't sitting in there during the trial, probably. These are the, as we try to kind of figure out where does the text come from, how did it get developed, right? So it's not really challenging. I don't want you to think that it makes it unreliable or something along those lines, because I don't think that's the case. I think what it just does is it kind of forces us to ask the question of, why use the phrase, where did this language set come from? Where did this way of talking about it come from? And again, I think the chicken and the egg thing might be the best illustration. Which came first, the confession or the gospel? So there's just a possibility, right? And a possibility doesn't mean that it's definitely the way that worked. And so we want to be careful about hanging things on possibilities, which is why we look at that broader base of information and evidence. What we see is this development of Jesus living into and enacting the life of the Messiah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. What else? Anything else?
Not for me.
Not really.
Okay. All right. Dorothy, you have any thoughts?
No, I think you just reaffirmed a lot, which I believed already,
Oh, good.
And I also think that all scripture is God-breathed. And I think if something wouldn't be right, the people who over the years have put the Bible together, I think the Spirit speaks to them. And I think they are led by what they should write, what they shouldn't write. So I kind of lean on that when there's something I don't understand.
I like it. I'm with you. I am with you 100% on that one. So, well, good. All right. For those of you listening at home, watching at home later, we will be back in 2 weeks on the first Wednesday in November. We're taking the last Wednesday in October off. So October 27th, there will be no Zoom room, no recording, but we hope you will join us in November as we continue this discussion of who did Jesus think he was? And as we look at the person and work of Jesus through history, theology, and literature.
Well, we really appreciate all your effort. You make us think a lot. So
thank you.
Appreciate that.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Well, until next time, love well, my friends.